Well, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rich Harvey, CEO of Propertybuyer. And today we are joined by Martin Zheng, Principal from Odin Mortgage, and also Pau Lam, the tax consultant from Odin Mortgages. Pau's one of the experts. If you need to get great tax advice and you're an expat, I should say, talk to the expert and get great advice. So today we'll be covering quite a range of topics. Martin, you'll be covering a whole range of finance issues, particularly around expats and how to secure the best kind of loans. I'll be giving a bit of an update about the property market and a few case studies and where the opportunities lie. And Pau, really looking forward to your input around the tax issues as well. And we will be leaving plenty of time, everybody, for Q&A at the end. So on the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a Q&A box. So as we go through the presentation, please type in your questions. Don't leave it till the end. Write them in there. We will try to get to as many as possible as we can. Can't promise we'll get to them all, but we will definitely have them there and try to get to those as well. So Martin, without further ado, can I hand over to you, please, to kick us off tonight?
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Rich. All right, cool. So look, I will be going over an Australian lending overview today, and that will probably be some fresh materials based on recent market changes, and then followed by 3 expat mortgage brokering tips. So unfortunately, for those who have listened to my webinar before, the content towards the end may be something you have seen before, and that's because mortgages are pretty straightforward. It's pretty much the same thing over and over again, but I will pass it back over to Rich, who will give a real-time, on-the-ground market update as to what's happening on the ground. But in terms of lending overview, so obviously everybody sees the headline rates, 2.85%. The RBA's forecast for inflation is supposed to peak this year and then hit 4% in 2023, and then followed by, I think it's 3% in 2024. So their expectation of inflation is coming down. But as with all economists' forecasts, they are quite volatile, and you just got to take it at face value, I guess. So the RBA says they'll increase rates over the next couple of months, and banks have actually stopped preemptively increasing rates. So what's happening now is the RBA will increase their rates, and then the banks will follow, as opposed to about 3 to 4 months ago, where the banks were really trying to predict what the RBA was going to do and just try to get ahead of the RBA. The most interesting thing I think about the increase in rates is you can see kind of the average over the last 10, 20, 30 years. The current rates of 2.85 are really just overtaking the 10-year average. So they will have a little bit more to go, probably up to the 4 to 5% mark. So one of the key themes for mortgages is try to get ahead of the rate hikes and don't think too much about the price, because that's a bit harder to predict. So next slide, what does it mean for house prices when interest rates go up? So obviously the textbook answer is when interest rates go up, prices come down. But as you can see, over the past 30 years, we've had about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or 5 interest rate hikes over the past 30 years. And though that black line to me seems like it's just going straight up and to the right. Of course, past prices are not indicative of future prices. So it is a bit harder to tell where prices are going, but that's where you get an expert like Rich to help you predict, or I guess find undervalued properties. My view is that nobody really knows where prices are going. Is where the rates are going. So the RBA said that the interest rates will be around 3 to 5% over the next 1 to 2 years. Is that really significant? Yes, probably for your repayments every month. It'll increase it by 3 to 4 to 500, depending on your loan size. But your prices, if that's what you're waiting on, is probably not going to shift too much. Then you have another scenario, which is hyperinflation, right? So if inflation really does get out of control, do you want to be holding real assets like property? Then you've also got recession. So in a recession, everything becomes unpredictable. So yeah, that's kind of what's happening for house prices. So I guess the question that everybody's asking is, what should we do? So my thinking is focus on the questions that matter, right? So what are the questions that matter? As an expat, the questions that matter to you are, will I eventually move back to Australia? Most often, the answer is yes. The question is, am I taking advantage of my expat status? And the third question is, should I get ahead of these rate hikes? And the final question is, do I actually have an ability to time the market? So I'll address each of these, right? So the first one is the housing cycle. The housing cycle is largely outside of our control. You'll see from the first image, it kind of just ebbs and flows, and no one can really predict the market. And there's always going to be high spots, low spots. But the expat cycle is something that you can control, right? So the first element is expats are in the first section, right? They're overseas, they have high compensation with low tax. They have a strong asset position versus liabilities. It's currently a weak Australian dollar, and you have the strongest borrowing power and purchasing power than you would at any other time in your life, assuming your income stays the same, which obviously it won't. But so assuming that situation and using a $1.5 million purchase as a base case, that would be the purchase price you would be looking at. Now, depending on if you get ahead or behind rate hikes, your purchase price is probably going to come down a little bit because of the higher interest rates guided by the RBA, and also more regulatory tightening around how much they'll actually let you borrow. That reduces your borrowing and the size of your purchase by, let's say, 100 or 200K. And then the third situation, third element to this is when you repatriate. So when you repatriate back to Australia, you're likely going to have reduced compensation package, you're going to have higher taxes, and you're going to have more deductions with regards to HEX, Medicare, and Super. So again, that reduces your borrowing and the size of your purchase. So the key takeaway is don't focus too much on where the cycle is at the moment and where prices are at, because that's kind of Rich's specialty, is helping you identify those properties that are undervalued and could be a bargain, right? Where the overall market and how much it's got to fall from here, it's really outside of your control. What you really want to focus on is things inside your control, which is that expat cycle. Next slide. So as of 2022, January, the interest rates are around 2 to 3%. So using Singapore as an example, some of you are based in Singapore, what deposit would you need to buy that $1.5 million property? Well, the answer would be you'd need about 20%, which is about 300K. So in January, the interest rate, the exchange rate was about 1 to 1. So if you had 300K in Singaporean dollars, you would have about 300K in Aussie dollars for a deposit, right? And you would also have about 185K of repayment ability, assuming that was your income per year. And converted to Australian dollars, that's also 185K per year. So you could purchase about a property worth about 1.5 mil. Fast forward to today, the RBA cash rates are around 5 to 6%. So that has effectively reduced your borrowing power. The FX rate has moved in expats' favor. US dollar, Hong Kong dollar, Singaporean dollar, dirhams has all moved in our favor as expats, right? So that same 300K Singaporean dollars is now worth 325K, possibly more if you had dirhams or Hong Kong dollars or US dollars. So you now have a bigger deposit and you have stronger borrowing because your income based in foreign currency has also gone up. And house prices have corrected around 5 to 10%. So really, 4 out of those 5 factors have moved in your favor. So for those of us who were thinking 1 year ago, I just wait for the market to get a little bit better, I'll wait for my situation to get a little bit better. Well, actually, the situation has gotten a lot better for expats as of today. So if you're still waiting, then I don't know if the market's going to change or not. I don't try to predict that. What I can tell you is in 3 to 6 months from now, your interest payments have definitely gone up. And on that factor alone, your borrowing power will be reduced. In terms of deposit and FX and house prices, I won't try to speculate on that. I just know for a fact that interest rates will go up and that will reduce your borrowing power and your repayments. So how have rates changed? As of October 2021, rates were around 2.8 to 2.9%. And we were really recommending our clients to fix their rates back then, right? We were recommending 1 year, 2 year fixed rates so they can use an offset account. Those with the crystal ball and with the foresight to see inflation creep up, and if they manage to fix their rates for 5 years, those guys were the geniuses, right? So even I did not expect rates to rise as quickly as they did. Fast forward to today, average of 1 rate hike per month. These are the new rates, right? Investment variable rates, somewhere between 4 to 6%. And you look at those 5 year rates, they're creeping up to 7%. And with, I guess, maybe 3 or 4 more interest rate hikes to go over the next 6 months, you can probably expect these rates to climb to 5 to 6%. And your repayments and your borrowing is most likely going to have to come down. So that's pretty much the lending environment in a nutshell. So now I'll quickly run over some tips, and then I'll pass over to Rich. So tip number 1, use an expat mortgage broker. A lot of people ask me, can I get financing myself? Their answer is yes. You could do everything yourself, and then at the end of the day, you'll get rejected. Or you can use an expat mortgage broker like Odin Mortgage, where we do everything for you, and it's all completely free of charge. I'm going to go through these quickly because everyone's going to get a copy of these slides later. But for those of you who do want to pull your own hair out yourself, research which banks will apply Australian tax rates versus local tax rates, because some banks like the Big Four, it doesn't matter if you're earning 100K and paying no tax in the Middle East, they're going to whack on 45% effective tax rates on your income if you go to a Big Four, right? So your 100K of net income, which is the truth, now becomes 55K after tax in Australia. Research which banks will lend 80% LVR versus which banks will only lend 70% LVR. So if you don't have that savings, you really need 80%, you need to go to the right bank. And then research which banks have policies that are relevant and favorable to your situation. For example, some banks won't take bonuses, they only take multinational employers, and they won't allow equity cash out for refinancing. So that's something you got to be conscious of as well. Tip number 2, how to avoid settlement headaches when buying a property. And I think Rich will back me up here. Get a pre-approval, right? So if you don't take away anything from my conversation today, remember this, get a pre-approval. Understand how much you can borrow so you don't lose your deposit, so you don't have headaches. It's not the same as in Australia where you can put a offer down on a property, you got 14 days to find finance, you can rock up to a Big Four and give them a few documents and you'll get a pre-approval. It's not like that when you're overseas. They want to see employment proof, they want to see employment letters, they want to check all your bank accounts. It's a lot harder as an expat, so definitely get a pre-approval. It will also give you negotiating power, right? So what are the benefits, right? So they confirm how much you can borrow, they mitigate against a loss of deposit, they give you negotiating power, they're valid for 3 to 6 months, and they cost you nothing because all the bank fees are only payable upon settlement. So what does that pre-approval timeline look like? Well, step 1, get an online assessment from our website. Step 2, review your lender options and confirm the loan structure with our brokers. Step 3, upload your documents, submit an application, and then your loan is pre-approved. And that's when you can engage the lovely guys at our Propertybuyer to help you with finding and sourcing a property. Then you sign a contract and the settlement is handled by your advisors. So your brokers, your agents, your solicitors, who will really handhold you throughout the process because we know how hard it is for expats to purchase properties. All right, last tip, how to cash out equity from existing properties to use as a down payment. So for those of you who are already property investors and have had a good run over the past 5 to 10 years, you've probably got some equity in your property that can be unlocked, right? So unlocking capital gains that have accrued on existing property. So by not selling the property, it means you don't actually have to pay capital gains tax, right? So how to not give money to the taxman and keep it within the family. You can minimize your cash contributions from current savings for purchases. You can potentially restructure your current unfavorable mortgage because one thing that happens is banks will not tell you about the most favorable rates or discounts that are available to you in the market at the moment. I have clients at the moment who fixed with us for 2 years at 2 to 3%, and now that they've rolled off the fixed and moved into a variable rate of about 6 to 7%. And that's just horrible, right? The banks are not going to tell you that actually the true market rate is around 5 to 6%. So you actually have to call and negotiate with them. So that's also something we can help with. You can get cashback incentives by switching. And obviously there are also cons, right? So the cons are you actually have higher aggregate interest costs because you're taking on a larger mortgage. You'll have higher repayments. You could potentially be over leveraged. And usually when we refinance, we stretch out the repayments over another 30-year term. So you actually be in debt for longer, right? So it's not all just pros, there are cons, and you definitely need to consider these when you refinance or take on another mortgage. All right, so case study, this is one of our clients. 2015, they purchased a property, 600K, 80% LVR, 480K. The property value went up and they paid down the loan. The valuation was 800K with a 400K mortgage, so it's about 50% LVR. We helped them cash out 240K, which was then used towards a $1 million new purchase. So the total cash that they had to provide was only about $10,000. So it's not bad. If you want to buy a second property and you have some equity, you can really leverage on that first property to help you build out your property portfolio. All right, so I'll wrap up with 4 final tips before I hand it over to Rich. So tip number 1, use an expat mortgage broker if you're overseas. We've had clients that use Australian brokers and they couldn't get them more than 200K. They came to us and we could get them in excess of 800K purely because we knew which banks to take them to. Get a pre-approval to avoid headaches. Leverage on your expat status and your higher income to consider getting ahead of these rate hikes. And review your existing mortgages and properties for equity releases, cost savings, and cashback. So that wraps up my section. Rich, I'll hand over to you now.
Fantastic. Thanks, Martin. I can absolutely endorse the cash out strategy. I think that's fantastic. Really, really good idea. So I'll just share my screen here. I mean, that's how I built my portfolio, and I'll give some case studies in a minute, but absolutely leveraging the equity you've got, making sure you've got good serviceability. Exactly as you built that slide, that's exactly how I built my portfolio. So I'll talk more about that in a minute. But look, thank you, Martin and team, for the opportunity to present tonight. I just want to give a couple of things tonight, do an overview of the market. Just go to the next slide. There we go. So I want to do a market update. I want to talk about buyer psychology. Where are people at in the market at the moment? Talk about some case studies, and then after Pau's presentation, we'll open up for Q&A as well. So just a quick slide about myself. Been in business 21 years this year. Haven't had a party yet, but we should. We've won 40 awards for excellence, been contributing a lot of professionalism to the industry and help the industry really shine, in the words of buyers agents. And I'm also a qualified property investment advisor. So I get asked this question every single day, probably multiple times, and I'm sure many of you online will be asking this question as well: is now a good time to buy? And the answer to that question is, it depends on your personal situation. For me, I'm always looking to buy, whether the market's, strong, whether it's weak, whether it's going sideways, because there's always opportunities to do well in every market. And it really depends on your own personal objectives and what you're trying to achieve. So that's a whole other webinar about setting goals and strategies. But to be honest with you, now is actually, just in terms of market conditions, an excellent time to buy. And I'll tell you why. 2 big reasons. One you've already touched on, Martin, is the exchange rate discount. If you look at where the exchange rate was back in sort of April, we got to around, this is the Aussie dollar against the US, not against the Sing or Hong Kong dollar, but against the American dollar, it was up to around 75, 76 cents. It dropped to a low of around 62 cents. It's back up to around 67 cents as of today. So essentially, it's at least a 12 to 13% discount on what it was earlier this year. And Martin, as you said, if you combine that with property prices in Sydney, you're off 11%, they're off 6.9% in Melbourne, you're already well on your way to getting property at a significant discount to long-term value. And that's a pretty smart strategy to do that. And often buying when there's less competition, when there's less people around, is a really great thing. So let's have a look at talking about where other people are at and where the feeling of the market is. This is the Westpac Melbourne Institute chart, where they track and do surveys of over 1,000 people each week, looking at consumer sentiment. And what's interesting on this chart is just to look at where the bottom of this curve is compared to the depths of COVID, but also look back on the left-hand side, back into 2008. That was the bottom of the GFC. We're actually hitting those GFC levels of negative consumer sentiment. So it's pretty interesting. And I think as interest rates really start to flow through, we'll see some more negative sentiment next year. All right, let's have a look at where auction clearance rates are. The last sort of 6 months, beginning of the year, they were sort of touching 70, and they've really been hovering in the low 60% for much of this year. We did have a couple of weeks where it slipped just below 60. So in that 60 to 65% clearance rate, we're really looking at a balanced market. It's not a buying market. It's not a selling market. There's a real bag of mixed results in the auction market. What we're finding is that quality properties in really good locations that are well presented are still holding their value and selling well, compared to properties that are poorly presented or poorly positioned, and you're seeing discounts of 15% or more. So if you look at the trends with auctions, this is just for Sydney, similar chart for Melbourne as well. You can see since about March, as I mentioned, it's really dropped off. In the winter months, it drops off a bit more, and it's sort of hovering around that mid 60% there. So I'll give you a couple of other charts. We'll just talk about pricing. We'll talk about listings. We'll talk about discounting, days on market, and all the other basic stats. So what are we seeing over the last 12 months? We're seeing an interesting or a mixed bag of results. So we're seeing, actually, these are the sort of 31st of October figures. The latest ones are just coming out in literally about 2 days' time. So I haven't been able to update them because CoreLogic haven't released them yet. But Sydney will show around about a 10.9% discount, 11%, even though it's 8.6 there. Melbourne updated is around about 6.8%, something like that. Adelaide, Brisbane, Perth, still in positive territory. But if we look at the charts, you'll see on the next slide, they're actually slowing down. So what we're finding is the rate of decline in Sydney and Melbourne is slowing, and the other capitals are also catching the cold, if you like. So this is probably the best chart to show you here. So if we look at Sydney, you can see Sydney's this dark blue line here, and Sydney is starting to tick up a bit. In other words, the rate of decline is slowing. So you'll see Sydney, it was, during the boom, it was increasing 2% a month, right? And then obviously at the steep part of the curve, it was declining 2% a month. But now we're probably going to get back to, 1.5%, 1% a month, and eventually, I believe next year in Sydney, particularly, we're going to see the bottom of the market. I think we'll probably see it within about 6 months. So that's a good signal for all those on the line for my tip of when to buy. If you're trying to pick the market, the next 6 months is pretty much an ideal time. You see Melbourne is also starting to turn. Brisbane hasn't really, it's come off a bit, but not that much. And Adelaide is really just starting to hit negative territory. So if you look at this curve, also helps explain it as well. So CoreLogic measure property prices on a daily rate. And you can see, as I was saying, when property prices were, declining almost 2% a month. This is a combined capitals, but you can see the curve is starting to flatten. So the rate of decline is slowing down. So that's good news for people worried about the value of their properties. If we look at sales volume, so the number of properties that have been sold, we can see here that we're slightly above the total sales volumes. But when we get to listings, you'll see we're way under. But Sydney is significantly down, and Melbourne is significantly down in the volume of sales, as is Brisbane. So pretty interesting stats there. So actually, I'll just jump to median days on market. So this measures when a property goes on the market, how many days does it take to sell? During the boom, it was unbelievable in 2021. Properties were selling in like 1 to 2 weeks, or even a matter of days sometimes. It was absolutely insane. Now in Sydney, it's blown out to around 40, 42 days. Melbourne, it's now 32 days. Brisbane, it's around 31 days, whereas it was 14 days during the 2021 period. So we'll naturally start to see days on market blow out to probably around about 50 days for the two major capital cities. We look at vendor discounting. Now, this measures what a property asking price is and what it actually sold for. Now, it doesn't measure it obviously on auction properties, but for properties that are priced. So it's not the most accurate measure, but it does indicate a trend. And what it's showing is that the vendor discounting factor, particularly for Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne, Adelaide, most of the capital cities, is sort of heading toward that 4 to 5% level. Whereas you can see during the COVID period, it was a lot less. Vendors didn't need to discount much to get their properties sold. We look at listings. This is a very telling graph, and I sort of want to point out a couple of things here, because our job as buyers agents is to find the right property that fits the brief of every client. And our complaint is always there's not enough properties for sale or not enough choice. And this is a couple of reasons why. So if you look at new listings, that's the volume of properties that are new coming to market. Compared to the 5-year average, it's down 21%. So this dark blue line here shows you where the current year of new listings are. So around 21% compared to the 5-year average, which is pretty, a pretty significant number. And then if we look at the total number of listings, that's old and new listings, so all the listings, you can see here it's 27% down on the 5-year average. So that means that vendors are not selling their properties as readily. People are hanging on to it, waiting for the market to prove, aging in place, a whole bunch of reasons there's not as many properties on the market at the moment. And I think that, just back to that chart, I think that's going to continue as well. I think that vendors are going to be reluctant to sell unless they have to. So you'll typically find that properties on market will be generally more motivated vendors or people in a life circumstance that want to sell and get on with their lives. Let's talk about rents. So rents have literally gone through the roof. I've been fortunate. I've been able to raise the rents on all my properties portfolio quite significantly the last couple of months, and locked in some new tenants for some of them. I think we'll start to see that the rate of increase in rents will also slow, as it's indicated by this chart. It's at a national level, it's starting to level off. But look, pretty phenomenal rent increases. I mean, if you're a landlord, happy days. If you're a tenant, obviously it's not such good news. But I think we'll start to see that. But also there's some other factors that, to be honest with you, we probably see rents rise significantly in certain pockets where there's very limited supply. And I'll talk about some of the reasons for that in a moment. Dwelling approvals. Basically, we're not building enough properties to keep up with demand. You can see here the decade average on units, we're just below. But what's interesting, if you look at the charts here, we're starting to head below the curve. And I think it's going to be tricky waters for a lot of developers over the next 2 years. As rates start to rise and there's a drop off in demand, it's going to mean that we probably won't be building enough units, particularly to cope with the migrants that are coming into the country. You had a similar chart here, I think, to Martin, on your slide, but obviously we just know how far interest rates have dropped. I'll give you my prediction on interest rates. I'm one of the 40 economists that gets surveyed by Finder every month, and also NAB as part of their survey. I reckon we're going to have maybe 2, maximum 3 more interest rate rises. You can tell me next year if I'm right or wrong. There you go, you heard it from me. I reckon we'll probably see a terminal peak cash rate of 3.6%. The reason I think that is that inflation is already starting to come down. We're already starting to see some moderation there. And I think if the Reserve Bank tries to keep using interest rates as the only instrument to contain inflation, it's going to crash cart the property market. And if we get over 4%, I think there's going to be a lot more painful mortgage selling. And I think anything over 4 is going to bring too much pain to the economy or potentially tip it into recession. I don't think we're going to have a recession because I think we're quite adaptable. We've got some buffers, but that's my view on rates. I did put a few joke slides in here just for all you people that love a bit of maths there. So here we go. All right. I want to talk now about buyer psychology. Just where are buyers' heads at the moment? And there's one factor that I really want to drill down to as a big takeaway for everyone here. And you've touched on it too, Martin, in your presentation, is this idea of buyers waiting for the ideal time or waiting for the market to drop so much or just enough so I can get in. But the problem is you've got to balance that with just how much you can borrow. If your rates are going up, your borrowing capacity has probably dropped 22% in the last 12 months. And if prices have only dropped 10%, then you could potentially be priced out of the market simply because you can't afford to borrow as much. So, as you said, Martin, don't just focus on the interest rate or the price of the loan, focus on how much you can borrow to get into the market. That's always my advice. Some people get so caught up on the price, they forget about the value of what they're doing. A bit like the economist joke, right? The economists, they always read the menu from right to left, or they know the price of everything and the value of nothing. So just watch that dilemma there, guys, just in terms of trying to wait for the perfect time. So let's have a look at some of the economic headwinds, or tailwinds, as I call them, that are really impacting the property market. So I sat down the other day and I thought, what are the factors that are really, hitting us over the head, belting us over the head, that are going to be problematic for the property market? And simply, it's going to be rising interest rates. We've got depressed consumer sentiment. Cost of living is going through the roof. I mean, just look at the price of bread and milk and petrol and everything else you're paying for. It's crazy. Borrowing capacity diminished, and world events, share market uncertainty, war in Ukraine, what's happening in China. Like, there's lots of geopolitical factors happening around the world, and that all has an impact on buyer sentiment as well. But let's flip over to the positive side. Let's have a look at what's going to underpin the property market. And in my view, one of the big things is migration. That's, to me, the biggest savior in the property market. The government has increased the cap from 160,000 to 190,000. Plus, on top of that, you've got all the temporary visa holders. All the students are back. We need them back for our cafes. Honestly, we don't get enough cafe workers here at the moment, enough restaurant workers. So migration is a huge factor that's going to help really, really turbocharge our market again. As I mentioned, building approvals low. We've got an incredibly resilient economy. Like, we are very lucky in Australia to have such a versatile economy that weathers these storms. We don't tend to have massive, blowouts in our economy. Very low vacancy rates, strong rental returns, low unemployment. A lot of households still have buffers in place, although that's reducing as interest rates continue to bite. Wages are starting to grow. Construction costs rising. Now, why do I put that as a positive? It simply means that the replacement cost of your property is quite high. So when it comes to actually looking at what your property is going to sell for, rising construction costs really inherently increases the value of your home. We've got a couple of government schemes and also stamp duty reforms going in place. And basically, the best one is property is a hedge against inflation. I've bought properties since I've been age 24 and done really well out of it. And I can see, with the benefits of having decades of experience, that holding property is a wonderful thing. It's a great asset to hold long term. So here's the message: don't follow the herd. Simple as that. Run your own race as and when you're ready, when you can afford to get a mortgage. As I mentioned, migration is ramping up. I mean, look at this chart here from the Coolabah guys. We had a massive drop off, zero, migration, and then massive rebound. I think, as you can see here, we're going to be going above what we were previously. And I think the migration cap will be raised again next year because we just need more workers. And the students are back. The universities are getting their workers back. So that's another great factor as well. I want to talk just now about downturns versus upturns. And this is a study that's been done by CoreLogic on how long between peak of the market, which literally was October last year, through to the trough, which I believe will be around the middle of next year. Some people think it's a mug's game to try and pick the exact date. No one will know exactly. I can't say to you, hand on heart, on the 17th of July, 2023 will be the bottom of the market. I don't know. It will be sometime next year, right? But you can certainly read the tea leaves, and I get a very good indication. And being on the ground, watching the market every day, talking to my team of buyers agents, we have a very, very good handle on where the market is up to. So CoreLogic say that in the past 40 years, peak to trough has been around 8.5 months. And then from the bottom of the market, or trough, to recovery is 9 months to 3 years. I think we'll probably see around a 2-year cycle between peak of the market to when we get back to peak or above peak pricing, which is what the October 2021 prices were. And actually, I didn't put it in my slides today, guys, but Louis Christopher, one of the most respected researchers in Australia, has just put out his forecast this morning saying Sydney property prices, you heard it first, are going to rise between 5 and 9% next year. So there you go. Sydney's going to be leading the charge. And again, another analysis done by Nicola Powell, the domain economist, has looked at all of the times when the market has had massive upswings and then the quantum of the downswings. And you can see, the downswings are not that massive. Obviously, the one we're having now is probably one of the largest, but that's off the back of having one of the most significant increases we've ever had. So back in 2015, 2019, market dropped 7.9%. We're already at 11% in Sydney. I think we'll probably drop 15 to 20 from peak to trough. But that's off the back of a 40% increase in 2 years. So it's just normalizing the market. These are figures from Dr. Andrew Wilson, and this is sort of a net calendar year. I've got 3 slides in a row, so you've got to watch this pretty carefully. He's saying this is his forecast from January to December 2022. Sydney down 9, Melbourne 6. This is his predictions. Adelaide was up 10, Perth up 3. Nationally, we're down 4%. Next slide will show the 4-year period from 2019 to 2022. And then when you combine all of those together, here's the net result, right? So obviously Brisbane and Adelaide have been the standouts, but Sydney, 33% still up. Melbourne, 24% still up. Perth, 21% up. So what the message is here, don't freak out by downturns and don't freak out by upturns. It's a long-term game. It's about holding the asset, riding out the cycles is the message here. So just briefly, how can we help? And then I'll talk about some case studies. What we do as buyer's agents for all of our clients is go through this 7-step process. We help you identify a particular strategy that will suit your borrowing capacity and your goals. We provide research on the local areas that will meet your brief and give you examples of properties that have transacted so you know what your budget can buy. We then start the process of shortlisting suitable properties that fit the brief. So we look at everything, obviously, that's online as well as what is offline. We get access to a lot of off-market properties you'll never see on the internet through our extensive agent network. We've got over 25,000 agents on our database that we can find properties for. I mean, even tomorrow, I'm taking a client out tomorrow to look at some properties on the North Shore, Northern Beaches, and I've got 3 off-market properties to show them in their price range. We evaluate the one that you like. We do a detailed analysis of what it's worth. We appraise its value, give you advice on that. We complete due diligence, organise pest and building reports or strata reports, and then we step in and negotiate. We take out all the emotion, tell you what it's worth, and try to get it for the lowest possible price. And just really having us between you and the agent makes a huge world of difference. And particularly for expats, we can be your eyes and ears on the ground and tell you exactly what's going on. And then we manage the exchange and the settlement and the property management process as well. So the key benefits or value adds is, as I mentioned, just giving you a brief that's tailored for your situation. We don't sell off the plan properties. We don't flog house and land. We're none of that. We always buy established properties. If we do have a foreign buyer, we can buy new, and we'll also make sure we get any commissions rebated to you. But it certainly saves you a lot of time, gives you that local insights, and just essentially gives you confidence you're making a great buying decision. What else can we tell you here? What does it cost to use us? Obviously, we're not free, but we believe very strongly we deliver excellent value for our services. So it's a sliding scale of fees. It's actually a fixed fee basis, and it ranges between 1.5% to 2%, depending on what price point. So once you get over $2 million, it's essentially 1.5% above that. You pay an engagement fee between $3,000 and $5,000, and then we're off to search for the property. Now, if it is an investment property, it's also considered a tax deduction because it's considered part of the cost base. We can talk about that later, about the tax deductibility of that. So that's that. Again, I can share more information to everybody offline. I'll send a copy of the slides as well and give you more insights on how we operate. So I just want to give a couple of case studies for the second half of my presentation. So how are we going, guys? All good? Thumbs up. So yeah, got lots of questions, I hope. I can't see the questions on my presentation, but I hope there's some there, guys. So all good. Now, I'm going to share a couple of personal insights, and it's kind of weird doing it when I'm not face-to-face with everyone in their lounge rooms at the moment, but this is actually one of my properties here on screen that I bought back in 2007 in Melbourne. This was in Carlton, actually just up the road from Lygon Street, with the pasta capital of the world. Walking distance to Melbourne University. I actually did buy this from a builder. It was brand new, but great location, 3-bedroom plus study townhouse, 3 levels. It's got a great view of the city from the top level, really low maintenance, and haven't really had too much trouble from it, except from just repairing a little bit of water damage where a storm got into the balcony area. So yeah, it now rents for $900 a week. So I've made, what's my numbers? I've made $1 million on this just by holding it for 14 years. So it's been great. Keep revaluing it, and I've used that equity then to buy more properties. So that's just a classic buy and hold, no frills type investment. Yeah, happy with that. This is another one we just bought this year for a client in Brisbane. The client was looking for a property which had strong cash flow and reasonable growth as well. So we wanted to get a fairly modern property. We found a 4-bed, 2-bath, 2-car property. And this one, we actually managed to buy this at $40,000 below another offer that came in. And it was simply because our buyer had better finance terms and was a stronger buyer. And the owner didn't want to risk going with someone that wasn't finance approved. Just like you talked about, Martin, having that finance approval deposit ready is critical. And we saved this client 40 grand by having that in place for this property. So we appraised the rent at 930. We actually ended up getting 1,020, and it gave a gross yield of 5.93% in a strong growth area. So really strong investment property. We had another investor just purely looking more for a cash flow play. So this one was an apartment which was holiday let. Now, we don't always recommend this. It just depends on the strategy of the client, but they really was chasing yield. So we found a 2-bed, 2-bath apartment on the Gold Coast. Actual occupancy was 83%. Gross yield forecast was 11%. We actually got 13.9 on this property. So again, really strong cash flow on this property. Even after all the body corporate fees, it returns a net of around 9%. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to get that on a commercial property. So really, really great result. Challenging to find, but we did find it, and the client was super happy because we got it off market. This is another property of mine, actually just up the road from my office here on the Northern Beaches. This is just a little boring old red bricky 4-bedroom house with a granny flat behind the garage. So I bought this. Best time to buy was during the GFC. I think I bought 3 properties that year, Martin. It was just a great year to buy when the market was down, I tell you. Lucky I had the borrowing capacity to do it at the time. Wish I'd bought 4 more of them, if I could, right? We did a reno on this property, but we had a 1-bedroom granny flat behind the garage there, and it had never been used or rented out. And we renovated the kitchen, probably spent about 100 grand on the kitchen and bathrooms and flooring and everything. And now I'm getting almost $1,700 a week out of this property, and it's now valued at 2.4. So I made $1.5 million in capital gains out of this property. And having that granny flat really helps to boost your yield. So if we just had it rented normally, I'd probably get $900 to $1,000 a week, but I'm getting $595 for the granny flat at the back. We actually did a little bit of a reno on it 2 years ago. We had a huge bedroom and we subdivided the bedroom and made it a 2-bedroom flat. So I boosted the rent from $400 to $595 just by adding an extra bedroom. So pretty cool strategy. This was another property we bought in the Brisbane location. It was an existing duplex, and we managed to get this property for $770. Again, properties already had really strong growth, and the combined rent was $840. So it's delivering a 5.67% yield. So sometimes these properties can really give some great yield. So a good combination of growth and yield for this one. All right. Now I've got a heap of case studies, Pau. I'm not going to take up too much time because I don't want to give you plenty of time, but I've got a bunch more case studies. I'll just flick through a couple, but we can send these out as a PDF for everyone to look at. This was just for a home buyer client, Eastern Suburbs. You know, we saved them 25 grand through negotiating. This was one we did at Winston Hills in the northern suburbs of Sydney. Saved them a fair bit of cash. I'll flick through to another one. There's a really good one we bought. This was one in Melbourne. We got this before auction. I tell you, some of the units in Melbourne are actually going to become good value. Like units are going to become more in vogue as interest rates rise and people don't have the borrowing capacity to buy freestanding homes. I think units are going to perform quite well from a yield and a growth perspective. So if you can pick the right area that's not oversupplied, buy in a boutique building, you can do quite well and get a reasonable yield as well. Yeah, this was one we bought in the inner west, near the Glebe area. We got a cracking discount for our client here. Saved our client 280 grand off the price. So it just goes to show if you're in the right location, the right spot, and you got the right person on your side, you can save a stack of money as well. Plenty more case studies. Northern Beaches, there's one. I just want to duck to a commercial one as well. Oh, that's a high value one. Yeah, so we do buy commercial. I don't know if anyone online is interested in buying commercial property, but we do cover that. We also find development sites for our clients. A lot of the stuff, again, we do in the commercial space is purely off market, a lot less competitive. We've got great relationships with agents. This one we bought at a 3+3 year lease, increase already on the rents, 4% per annum. How good would it be to get a 4% increase on your rent every year? That's what you can do with commercial if you've got the cash or the ability to get into that area. So yeah, it can be quite lucrative as well. So look, I'm going to leave it there, guys. I've only given you I feel like I've only just touched the surface on examples, but love to hear some questions, but I don't want to take up too much time. Pau, thank you so much, and Martin. I'll hand over to you guys. There's my contact details on screen, and yeah, love to chat further. So Pau, I'll stop sharing and hand over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Rich, for all these wonderful insights, and also the protections on the interest rates, and that makes two of us. And we'll come back and see what happens
Exactly.
in next year this time. Let me quickly share my screen. For anyone out there, this is Pau Lam from Odin Tax. I'm a sister company of Odin Mortgage. And today we're going to talk about some basic boring tax topics, and probably one of the most important topic for next 6 to 12 months that will apply to a lot of the expats right here. And a disclaimer upfront, all this information are just general. It might not be applicable to your personal situations. Should you want to do a free consult with me, feel free to reach out to us after the seminar. So let's get started. Firstly, I want to talk about one of the basic topic for expats living overseas and how you should be aware of your personal tax residency situations. Should you be seen as a non-resident for tax purpose? If so, what happens, and what sort of income you need to report in Australia? So under the current tax rules, it was established in 1930, so it's almost 100 years, and that's why the government right now is looking to reform all these rules and want to be more modern into able to cope into the modern world now. So under the current one, what we'll be looking into is basically 3 tests. One is the reside test. Do you live in Australia, or are you living overseas, say Singapore, Hong Kong, UAE, or other part of the world? And they will also be looking into where are your family living in? Are you working overseas? Do you have employment? And also about your social ties. Are you enjoying the life in your local areas, or do you still have very tight connections back with Australia? And another test would be the domicile, where you live. Do you have a place of abode overseas? Are you living in an apartment? Are you living in a long-term lease in the country where you reside? So that all these small things will also be formed as part of the conditions when we look into your tax residencies. And the most, I would say, straightforward test that the tax office is now looking at is the 183 days. If you are staying in Australia for more than 183 days, then very simple how tax office will look into is likely, yes, you will be seen as a tax resident of Australia. And that implies that most of your foreign income, say your salary earned in overseas, will need to be reported back in Australia and pay tax. And you don't want that to be happening, because you could potentially put yourself in a position that you have to pay tax overseas and also double dip that income and pay tax in Australia. In general, just very general, if you are an expat living overseas in the long term, or have a stable job overseas, then very likely you can foresee yourself as a tax non-resident of Australia. And the taxes, the changes, this is something important that, and also a bit of background added to this, is the proposed change about the current tax residency rules was brought up by last government back in 2019, that year's budget. And they have consulted with different tax departments, tax organizations in Australia, and they come up with this reform. So what it means is they would use few other taxes to look into one's tax residencies. So that 183 days will be no longer available. What's more important is they will look into a 45 days taxes, which is much shorter than the current legislations. And they will also run a factor tax. So if you take a few of these factor tax and you stay more than 45 days in Australia, then yes, and if these changes get passed, you will become a tax resident of Australia. This change, this proposal has been brought up in 2019 and has been quiet for almost 2 years. We got nothing, no movement since the last government brought it up. But in the last budget, just back in October, we do see the Labor government has mentioned that they will be looking into this and pick it up from reviewing. So potentially this could be something that will happen in the next 6 to 12 months. And if you get past it, then obviously it will have a very significant impact for all the expats living overseas, because when we go into the factor tax here, you would clearly be easy to see that you might already take any 2 of these 4 taxes. So all these 4 taxes are about, do you have a right to reside in Australia? Simply a yes question to those if you are Australian citizen, or you do have a PR visa, and that grants you the right to live in Australia. And also, if you do have a property in Australia, that also take the boxes, as you do have a place to live in Australia, even though it's an investment property right now, but you do have the right to take it